this out. Oh, wait.
All right. I'm confident.
I'm really bad with technology. If it will work. Sorry, I'm trying to figure. Right, let's see. Is it up there?
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
your screen is. It's just your PowerPoint is not. Are you using PowerPoint or are you using Google Slides?
Yeah, I'm using PowerPoint, but it's not presenting.
If you're using PowerPoint, I think you're going to need to click the button that says your whole screen. But you did this lesson yesterday with
I
me.
know. All right, let's see.
Yeah, there you go. We see it now.
Wait. All right. So let's get started. So my presentation is on Opening Their Own Doors, Female Journalists in the Fashion Industry by Emily Price. So my foundation of interest, I really found my interest for my project when Dr. Brandt introduced our class to various new journalists, one of them being Joan Didion. And I actually ended up doing a short presentation where I analyzed her rhetoric critiquing her political discourse in two of her nonfiction works, which were El Salvador and Miami. Dr. Brandt also introduced me to Helen Gurley Brown. She initially sparked my interest because she took over the old Cosmopolitan magazine when it was just a bland family magazine and reinvented Cosmo into a magazine that spoke to young career-driven women, incorporated fashion, what femininity should be, and showed women how to embrace and accept their sexuality. And then fashion and society. Fashion's always been an interest of mine because I truly admire what fashion represents and how you can express yourself. And I've also loved to look at the trends throughout the decades and how it changes and reflects society. And during the 1960s, fashion was changing so rapidly, and the effects from World War II and the women's rights movements created a lot of change, not just for women, but society itself. And New York City became the epicenter of fashion for the world during World War II. So fashion magazines and ad companies really began to embrace this buzz and added to the boom of consumerism that was hitting. My research and understanding was I wanted to from my research and understanding there was a certain form of American patriarchy that was kind of, it wasn't being voiced, but it was still controlling women and also the fashion industry. And many of these styles and fashion trends that were going on in the late 50s and early 60s represented labels like the suburban housewife, the conservative look, or a simplistic look that reflected military style. And so Fashion and Society, I think this platform for fashion gave women, and it allowed them to have this to change these labels and change societal norms. So when I first got into my research, my early works, my research process at the beginning was very, very broad. And for the sake of time, I won't go into each of these works, but here are just a few of them. I knew I wanted to focus on Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion, so I narrowed down my research to two foundational pieces, one from each author. These two works were Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl, which I think it was published in 1962, and then Joan Didion's first piece that was ever published was featured in Vogue after she graduated from Berkeley University, and it was called Self-Respect, Its Source, Its Power. And I use both of these in my paper, and that gets me to my thesis, which my thesis is arguing that Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion's influence within the fashion industry played a crucial role shaping what independence meant to American women. both of these women took the opportunity that the fashion industry presented and initially led the second wave of feminism by deconstructing the past and helping transform society. Throughout my paper, I argue that these women used their careers in writing to show American women by opening these doors for a new, real, open, and liberal form of expression. This allowed women of society to feel and believe what they are voicing. In my paper, I also create a conversation of the three key themes of fashion. And I'm arguing that Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion incorporated these themes into their writing and in their careers, and that is what was so influential. So these three key themes are expression, creativity, and identity, as you see on screen. And I see that, Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion saw that fashion embodies aspects of expression, creativity, and identity, which, like I said, they integrated these three key themes into their careers and their work. And I think that's why American women found them so inspirational. It's because they encouraged this expression, they promoted this creativity, and delivered a sense of identity that women across America were able to find their independence. So for my first of the three key themes is expression, but I will go ahead and say that for the sake of time, I decided to only present one example from each key theme. In my paper, I do provide example of each theme, but for both Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion. But for this presentation, I just chose to present the best fit example. And that's for expression, I chose Joan Didion. Joan Didion encourages expression uniquely. It's indirect. She writes expressing herself through her hopes, wants, and fears in life. And self-respect at source its power evaluates this meaning of having self-respect and explains how honesty, integrity, and discipline are three key components of achieving it. She goes on to explain how character is the foundation for self-respect. And she says in her article, nonetheless, character, the willingness to accept responsibility for one's own life, is the source from which self-respect springs. And I love that quote. She encourages women to find the self-respect and to feel good when one finds it. I think that's liberating. And she later says, to free us from the expectations of others, to give us back to ourselves, there lies the singular power of self-respect. And I think these quotes from her article just help inspire women to find not only self-respect, but self-worth. So on to my next one of the themes is creativity. For promoting creativity, I chose Helen Gurley Brown. Helen Gurley Brown defines creativity. I mean, she's the definition of it. She's creative because she not only sought out a magazine that targeted a readership that no other publishing company wanted, but she took Cosmopolitan and strategically used rhetoric and diction to create Cosmo's image. One of my secondary sources states that Helen Gurley Brown articulated a girl-style American dream that promised transcendence from class roles as well as sexual ones. Brown was one of the first mainstream figures to free women from the guilt of the premarital sex by advising them to disregard the patriarchal double standard. That's from Laurie Ouellette, which was my secondary sources. The next thing, though, why she's so creative is because the magazine, she created content. I mean, she created the first nude male centerfold of articles about sex toys or how to initiate romance in the workplace. She even published in her first piece, which you can see on the screen, the big Cosmopolitan, the pink one. She even put a piece about birth control and contraception, which, as you can see in these pictures on the slide, she wanted these taboo topics right on the cover of every issue. So when you're walking by that newsstand, you're going to glance over and you're going to see these taboo topics, and people of this generation picked that stuff up and wanted to read it. And I had to add the centerfold of Burt Reynolds because why not? Um, but, and then lastly, the slogan, "The Cosmopolitan Girl," was created by Helen Gurley Brown when she took over Cosmo. It was a catchy slogan, and it really represented the mission, vision, and values of the new and improved Cosmopolitan magazine. And this creative slogan had women all across America aspiring to be a Cosmo girl. And it meant that you were a working girl that was financially independent, you took charge of your own sex life, and had hopes and dreams that you were going to achieve. Helen Gurley Brown promoted this creativity in tons of other ways, but I think she really impacted American women by creating this content that, not it had never really been seen before, but people also just didn't talk about this stuff. And she made this taboo content okay. And she made society want to read it, and she made writers want to write more of this stuff. And I think that's initially why I, chose her for this slide, is because she was very creative. Um, so my last of the three key themes is defining a sense of identity. And, while Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion were two women that never lost sight of their identities, Joan Didion does it in a very specific way. Joan Didion defines her identity to herself and her audience in a way that embodies fashion. In the documentary film Joan Didion, The Sinner Will Not Hold, she says, it's on Netflix, it's really good. But she says, "Don't you think some people are formed by the landscape they grow up in? It formed everything I ever think or ever do or ever am." And I think Joan Didion found her identity in the landscapes that shaped her, and one of those places being Vogue magazine. Didion says that Vogue shaped her career while California shaped her as a person. Didion even gives credit to Vogue magazine for teaching her how to be a writer, and I think that reflects in her work because she is a very visual writer. Her writing produces more than just feelings and visuals, but also narrative, intellect, sophistication, and serious compositional control. And she creates her literary works with purpose to draw one in, paint that picture in one's mind. And, Joan Didion's fashion and personal style is a collective image of what her work embodies. And, her image communicated to young women and people all across the world that her identity and independence is and expressing oneself is one of the most important guidelines of fashion, which is to always be yourself. So that brings me to my conclusion, which I just want to say, significantly, Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion used the 1960s growing phenomenon of fashion and femininity as a stepping stool into the writing realm, opening doors for this new wave of feminism. Women started to envision a brighter future for themselves. They were given the opportunity to be inspired and get inspired. And they both used the fashion industry as a conduit to open the doors for American women to express themselves, to be creative, and find their identity. And that alone is what gave women their independence. Marshall McLuhan was introduced to me by the wonderful Dr. Purdue in a communications course last semester. And a concept in his book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, he says the medium is the message. And then he later goes on to say, the message of any medium is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. I put this in context with my research and my project because it's not what fashion did for Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion, but it's how they use fashion to transmit their messages to American women. And I think that's probably one of the most important things and most interesting things that, I realized after doing all my research. And finally, on a personal note, this project and the research I have done has really opened my eyes to what the fashion industry stands for in a historical context. And, I aspire to be the influence for my generation as Helen Gurley Brown and Joan Didion were for theirs. With all that being said, I do hope one day to work in communications and fashion, and I think my research will really help me when I'm applying for jobs in the industry. So that is all, but here is my work cited in my presentation and my image citations. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'm going to ask everybody to look over to the chat and direct your questions to Emily there. Patience, Emily, as people get their thoughts together.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I have not read the White Album. I saw it, and I think in my beginning research, I looked into a little bit of it. What I did find really interesting was that all of her works that she produces, nonfiction and her novels, is she bases a lot of her, like tone of it off of, things she's experiencing. So I know her daughter died and her husband died, and I know she wrote a few books based off of that. But I will definitely read it. Ooh, Dr. Taylor, I think that would be really interesting. Come on, no questions.
It's a really it's a good one for understanding how fashion fits into like semiotics and like a system of signs, and how it's connected back to some of the questions of power that you're bringing up about feminism. So I think it's a really interesting one. I highly recommend it. It's from the 60s, I think. But
ooh, how did I not find that? Do you see Cosmo? I think that, I mean, yes and no. I think that Cosmo, when in the 1990s, I think Cosmo, there was a lot of critique, and I talk about it in my paper, how criticism of, Helen Gurley Brown's approach to how she was, kind of like doing a fictional kind of over-sexualization of things. But I do think the online orientation environment, a lot of these columns in the 1960s in Cosmo were how-tos, or, take this quiz about your hairstyle or what kind of shoes you like. And I think a lot of that has kind of moved to online, because now you can go on BuzzFeed and you can sit there and answer, all these quizzes. And I think the online aspect of things really jumped when technology got revamped.
All right, very good. I'm going to cut our conversation, but everybody please raise your hands and show your appreciation for Emily. And our next presenter should be, oops, I'm now out of order here. Apologies for the delay, but it should be Matt Davis. Matt, if you are ready, you can go ahead and unmute your microphone.
Okay.